The last gift Alice received from the children she dearly loved was to be abandoned on a desolate highway. At 73 years old, alone with her old suitcase, she believed she no longer had any reason to live. But just as she reached her deepest despair, a cry changed everything. It wasn't her cry. It was the cry of a child running from a demon in human form. A true story that will make you ask the question, what does family truly mean? It's so good to have you here. Let me know what city you're watching from. Hit that like button to support the story, and let's find out together what happened to Alice. In that year of 1983, when the Illinois sun shone with an intensity that made the dry earth of the roads bake, Alice was excitedly preparing for a trip her children had promised her. Gregory and Sharon, the two only fruits of her sacrifice, had arrived that morning at the small house where she had lived alone for a long time. Gregory told her that after so many years of work and loneliness, she deserved a rest, that they had thought about taking her to a place in the country where she could breathe clean air and forget the worries of daily life for a while. Sharon reinforced those words, assuring her it would be a gift for her, a way of thanking her for everything she had done as a mother. Alice, at 73 years old, felt that her children were finally thinking of her well-being and accepted with a tired smile, carefully gathering the simplest clothes she had and packing them into an old suitcase, the same one that had accompanied her through so many moves in her life. As she slowly folded a white cotton blouse, she remembered how she had raised them alone, fighting against poverty and hunger, and she felt that this trip was a late but true gesture of love. The journey began with an uncomfortable silence inside the car. Alice sat in the back seat, watching the flat, dry landscape stretching beyond the window. At first, she tried to start a conversation, asking tenderly where exactly they were taking her, but Gregory answered evasively, saying she would see, that it was a surprise. Sharon, from the passenger seat, just stared straight ahead, showing none of the enthusiasm one would expect in such a situation. The old woman felt a slight tremor in her hands, not just from age, but from the strange coldness she felt in the atmosphere. She looked at her children's eyes in the rearview mirror and realized there was no warmth in them, only a hardness she had never seen before. She thought to herself that perhaps she was imagining things, that maybe exhaustion was making her see what wasn't there, and she forced herself to smile, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. As the car moved forward, memories flooded Alice's mind. She saw Gregory as a child, running barefoot through the dirt yard while she called him to wash his hands before eating. She remembered Sharon with her long braids, crying when her only rag doll broke, and how she, with needle and thread, had repaired it so her daughter wouldn't suffer anymore. Those memories gave her the certainty that she had been a good mother, that she had given her entire life to these two beings who were now driving her in this car. However, something in the air told her this was no ordinary outing, and the weight of that suspicion pressed on her chest. After a long drive of dust and curves, Gregory stopped the car on a lonely highway, surrounded by dry brush and with no sign of nearby houses. Alice looked up, confused, and asked in a trembling voice why they were stopping there. Gregory got out of the car with a serious expression, opened the trunk, and pulled out the old suitcase she had packed. He handed it to her without looking her in the eyes, and in that instant, the old woman understood what was happening. Sharon remained in her seat, motionless, avoiding all eye contact, while her mother, heartbroken, could barely believe this was real. Alice said in a broken voice that she didn't understand. What did all this mean? Why were they giving her the suitcase in the middle of nowhere? Gregory replied curtly, his voice flat and businesslike. It's for the best. We have our own mortgages and our own lives. You are. An expense we can no longer afford. Sharon then added, not even looking at her, just staring at her own hands in her lap. He's right, Mother. It's just easier this way. For us. The words "for us" struck Alice harder than a physical blow. It wasn't just abandonment, it was an execution of her worth. Alice fell to her knees on the dusty ground, clutching her suitcase as if it were a lifesaver. She looked at her children with eyes filled with tears and said she had given them her whole life, that she had deprived herself of food so they could have a bite on the table, that she had worked until her hands bled so they would want for nothing. Gregory interrupted her, saying that those stories from the past didn't change the present, that now they had their own families, their own problems, and that she was too heavy a burden. The old woman wept with a pain that tore through the air, extending her hands toward them, pleading with them not to leave her, that she could still be useful, that she could still love. But Gregory got back in the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine without looking at her. Sharon glanced back at her mother for a second, and a shadow of remorse crossed her face, but she was unable to act. She rolled down the window just enough to say that one day she would understand, that perhaps it was all for her own good, and then she turned her face forward so she wouldn't see her anymore. The car sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust that completely covered Alice. It's an unimaginable cruelty to be erased by the very children she gave everything to. Alice believes her life is over, but destiny often waits in the most desolate of places. Let's stay with her and see what this lonely road has in store. She tried to run after the car, but her tired, weak legs couldn't carry her more than a few steps before giving way. She fell to the ground, her fragile body hitting the rough earth. From there, with a broken voice, she screamed her children's names, Gregory, Sharon, over and over until her throat was dry and her words blended with the wind. The car disappeared in the distance, leaving her alone on that endless highway. The silence that followed was as cruel as the abandonment itself. Alice remained on the ground, trembling, clutching her suitcase, as her tears fell onto the dry earth as if trying to give it life. In her heart, disbelief, rage, and a sadness so deep it seemed to break her from within, all mixed together. She thought that the end of her road had come. Her children had erased her entire existence with one blow. She was nothing. Less than nothing. Just roadside trash waiting to be forgotten. The spark of hope she'd read about in stories felt like a cruel joke. There was only the dust, the cold, and the suffocating realization that the two lives she had created had just signed her death warrant. In that instant, evening began to fall over Illinois. The sky turned reddish, and the sun slowly descended toward the horizon, casting long shadows on the road. Alice did not move for a long time. She remained a crumpled shape on the rough earth, her mind numb, waiting for the end she felt she deserved. There was no inner strength left. It had been extinguished with the roar of her children's car. She did not think about not giving up. She was actively welcoming the darkness. But the body is a stubborn, primal thing. As the cold of the desert night began to seep into her bones, an involuntary, agonizing shiver racked her frame. It was a reflex, an unwelcome insistence on life. It was this reflex, and this alone, that forced her to move. With an effort that felt pointless, she got up, picked up her suitcase, and sat on the shoulder of the highway. Her face, bathed in tears, showed the mark of a life of sacrifice that had not been rewarded. And as the wind blew through the dry brush, Alice closed her eyes and murmured a silent prayer. Not for strength, but for a quick end, not knowing that this very road, witness to her abandonment, was about to become the place where destiny would give her life meaning again. Night had begun to fall on the Illinois countryside when Alice, her soul still torn apart by her children's betrayal, found herself walking aimlessly along the edge of that dusty road that seemed to have no end. The sky was stained, a melancholic orange that would soon be replaced by darkness, and every step she took felt like a struggle against the weight of her pain and age. Her feet, barely covered by worn-out shoes that had seen too many winters, dragged across the dry earth, kicking up small clouds of dust that made her cough. She thought again and again of Gregory and Sharon, repeating to herself the words they had said when they abandoned her, trying to understand how it was possible that those children who had once been her reason for living, whom she had fed with the sweat of her brow and protected even at the cost of her own health, could now leave her there as if she were a worthless burden. She muttered under her breath that she didn't understand why, that she hadn't been a perfect mother, but she had given everything she had. And that mixture of disbelief and anguish burned in her chest like living embers. The road stretched out, lonely, with dry brush on both sides, and a silence so profound it seemed to mock her. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and every time she tried to walk more than a few yards, she felt her strength leave her. The heat of the day had given way to a cold air that chilled her bones, reminding her of the fragility of her 3-year-old body. Her knees ached as if thousands of needles were piercing them, and more than once she nearly fell. Finally, when she thought she couldn't go on, she spotted the shadow of a solitary tree in the middle of that deserted landscape. With an almost superhuman effort, she headed toward it, dragging the old suitcase she still held as her only companion, and upon reaching it, she collapsed onto the ground, leaning her back against the rough trunk, which stood as the only refuge in that ocean of desolation. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to catch her breath, while her tears ran freely down her wrinkled cheeks. The silence of the countryside enveloped her like a heavy blanket, broken only by the occasional rustle of a dry branch moved by the wind. Alice felt that the loneliness was crueler than the hunger or exhaustion, because in that silence there were no voices to comfort her. There was no children's laughter or words of affection, only the bitter certainty that she had been left behind by those who should have loved her most. Suddenly, her sobs began to flow uncontrollably, a weeping that came from the depths of her soul and echoed in the night like an ancient lament, a song of pain that seemed to mix with the whisper of the wind. She said between sobs, why had they done this to her? What had she done wrong? Did her care, her sleepless nights, and her sacrifices mean nothing? She brought her trembling hands to her face, hiding her tears, and remembered how, as a child, Sharon used to run and hug her when she was scared, and how Gregory looked at her with pride when she managed to bring home a little bread. That memory hit her violently, and a feeling of emptiness pierced her heart. The cold of the night began to intensify, and Alice, trembling, tried to get comfortable on the dust-covered ground. The tree offered some protection, but its trunk was hard, and the rough ground hurt her fragile bones. Still, she clung to her suitcase as if it were the last link to her past, the only witness that she still had a place in the world. With a barely audible voice, she began to pray, asking God not to let her die there, to give her strength to hold on for at least one more day, although deep in her heart, she felt that death would be a relief after so much humiliation. Her parched lips could barely form the words of the prayer, but each one came out loaded with faith and desperation, a desperate plea from a mother who had not lost her capacity to love despite the pain. After a while, her tears began to dry, and an unbearable thirst forced her to open her eyes and look around. Her throat burned as if she had swallowed embers, and her lips were cracked from the dry air. It was then, in the midst of the night's silence, that she heard the faint murmur of running water. With renewed effort, she slowly got up, leaning on the tree trunk to keep from falling, and walked a few steps in the direction of the sound. Her feet stumbled over rocks and roots, and more than once she nearly collapsed, but the hope of finding water kept her going. Finally, among the bushes, she discovered a small creek that snaked under the pale moonlight. She knelt awkwardly by the bank, dipped her wrinkled hands into the cold water, and brought them to her mouth, drinking greedily as if that stream were a miracle sent from heaven. The water ran down her throat, relieving the dryness, and for a moment, Alice felt life return to her tired body. She looked at her reflection on the trembling surface of the creek and barely recognized the face looking back at her. It was an old woman with messy gray hair, eyes red from crying, and skin marked by time. She whispered that she didn't recognize herself, that she didn't understand how she had gotten to this point, that she never imagined she would end her days alone in the middle of a road, betrayed by those who once called her mother. However, as she watched herself, she also felt that inside her there was a spark that had not yet gone out, a silent strength that told her she must resist, even if she didn't know why or for whom. She staggered back to the tree and lay down again under its shadow, closing her eyes, hoping to sleep a little. The cold wind caressed her face, and the nearby murmur of the water gave her a strange comfort. She thought that perhaps she wasn't completely alone, that nature itself had taken pity on her, offering her a tree to rest under and a creek to quench her thirst. That idea brought a faint smile to her face, fragile but sincere, and in that instant she murmured that if life had given her such a harsh trial, it must have some hidden purpose. Her words floated in the darkness like a whisper full of faith, as exhaustion gradually overcame her and her eyelids closed. Thus, under that solitary tree, and with the sound of water as a lullaby, Alice spent her first night of abandonment, not knowing that in the midst of that loneliness The seed of an encounter that would change her destiny forever was being sown. Dawn arrived with a faint glow that stained the horizon with golden and pink hues. And it was in that instant that Alice slowly opened her eyes after a night of sleeplessness and tears. Her bones ached as if each one carried the weight of all her accumulated suffering. And her eyelids were still heavy from the fatigue of crying, but deep inside her being, something remained lit, a tiny spark that refused to be extinguished. She sat up with difficulty, pressing her wrinkled hands against the rough trunk of the tree that had sheltered her during the night. And as she did, she felt a chill seep into her bones, reminding her that the world continued on its course, indifferent to her pain. The early morning wind caressed her face, marked by deep wrinkles, and as she watched the sun rise on the horizon, she thought that life, despite her children's cruelty, was still giving her the chance to breathe for one more day. In a low voice, almost a whisper that was barely audible in the silence, she said to herself that if the sun could rise one more time, so must she, even if the pain was tearing her apart inside. As the sky brightened little by little, the memories of a lifetime returned to her mind like an overflowing river. She remembered the days of her youth when she worked tirelessly, washing other people's clothes by hand, to get a few coins to buy macaroni and cheese for Gregory and Sharon. She remembered how her hands cracked from the icy water and harsh soap, but how she found strength every time she saw her children eagerly eat the little food she managed to bring to the table. She thought of the endless nights sewing under the dim light of a lamp, mending her little ones' torn clothes, and how many times she preferred not to eat dinner so they could go to sleep with full stomachs. Her lips trembled as she remembered the day a young Gregory told her that when he grew up, he would always take care of her, and also that time when Sharon, sick with a fever, asked her to never leave her alone. Words that at the time seemed like eternal oaths, but now, after being abandoned, sounded like cruel echoes of broken promises. The pain she felt in her heart began to transform into something more intense, into a contained rage that made her insides burn. It wasn't a blind hatred, but a silent fury against ingratitude and the injustice of life. She murmured in a hoarse voice that she didn't deserve this fate, that it wasn't fair to have given her youth, her health, and her dreams for two children who, in the end, had treated her like a nuisance. She said that if God had given her the strength to bear them, raise them, and support them in the midst of poverty, then he would also give her the strength to endure the trials she now faced. Her tears began to flow again, but this time they were not of helplessness, but of a courage born from the depths of her soul. She felt like a withered plant that still had one root clinging to the earth, and that root, though weak, refused to die. With her heart pounding with conflicting emotions, Alice promised herself she would resist, even if loneliness crushed her and the world had forgotten her. She told herself that she couldn't let her children's cruelty mark the end of her story, that she still had dignity, that she still had life in her veins, and that every breath was proof that she was not defeated. She pronounced in a low voice that even though Gregory and Sharon had turned their backs on her, they couldn't take away her capacity to love or her faith that life still had something in store for her. That promise was a balm that restored her strength, and she slowly stood up from the ground, brushing the dust from her worn skirt, looking down the road as if searching for a sign that her struggle had meaning. The wind hit her face, and she interpreted it as a push from life, challenging her to keep walking. As she took a few steps forward, her legs still trembling, she spoke to herself again, saying she didn't know how long she could hold on, that loneliness was a burden as heavy as abandonment, but that at least she wouldn't give up in that moment. She raised her gaze to the sky and said that if dawn had come for everyone, it must also come for her, and that even though her children had decided to erase her from their lives, she would not let her spirit fade without a fight. With every word that left her lips, the morning air filled with a mixture of fragility and courage, as if the old woman, in the midst of her tired body, was awakening a hidden strength she didn't even know she had. And so, with hesitant but firm steps, Alice began to face the new day, embracing her fragility as part of her humanity, and transforming her pain into the courage needed to survive. Days bled into a blur of scorching sun and freezing nights. Alice lost track of time. Was it the third day? The fourth? Her body, frail to begin with, was beginning to fail. The water from the creek kept her alive, but hunger was a constant, gnawing ache. Her hope, once a small spark, had dwindled to a cold ember. She was no longer just abandoned. She was fading. She had begun to pray not for rescue, but for a quick, painless end. The loneliness was an abyss, and she was falling. As night fell once more, Alice, resting under the tree that had become her tomb-like refuge, tried to find some rest, but the memory of her children's abandonment kept her awake. Her body was weak, her knees ached, and the cold made her shiver, as if every gust of wind reminded her she was alone in a world that seemed to have forgotten her. She closed her eyes, intending to sleep, but her heart fluttered restlessly, and her mind replayed the image of the car driving away in the dust, taking Gregory and Sharon, tearing away what little security she had left. As her lips murmured a trembling prayer, asking for strength to endure, she suddenly heard a noise that made her open her eyes wide with alarm. It was small, quick footsteps, seeming to move through the nearby bushes. Her heart leaped, thinking perhaps a wild animal was approaching in search of food, and her survival instinct made her clutch the old suitcase to her chest, which she still kept as the only testament to her past life. The sound repeated, closer now, and Alice, her soul hanging by a thread, held her breath. She sat up slowly, leaning on the tree trunk, and fixed her gaze on the darkness. The high moon faintly illuminated the silhouette of a small body emerging from the bushes. It wasn't an animal, but a child. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her brown hair was tangled and covered in dust. Her cotton dress was torn in several places, and her bare feet showed cuts and scratches from the stones on the road. She advanced slowly, as if fear forced her to look everywhere for a refuge, and her small shoulders trembled with every sob that escaped her throat. Alice was breathless, unable to understand what such a small creature was doing alone at this time of night in such a desolate place. The girl stopped a few yards from the tree, and when she looked up, her large, tear-filled eyes reflected a pain that Alice recognized immediately because it was the same pain that burned in her own chest. She asked her in a trembling voice who she was and what she was doing there, and the little girl, in a thin voice broken by sobs, replied that her name was Mia, and that she had run away from home because she couldn't stand the beatings and yelling from her stepmother, Veronica, anymore. Alice's eyes widened in astonishment, and she asked in a tone of disbelief if someone could really treat such a defenseless creature that way. And Mia, between sobs, affirmed that yes, Veronica insulted her, punished her for no reason, snatched food from her hands, and hit her when her father wasn't home. She said she couldn't take it anymore and had decided to escape, even without knowing where to go, because any place would be better than that hell. Alice felt a bolt strike her heart upon hearing those words. The rage and pain she had accumulated from her own abandonment mixed with an infinite tenderness for this child who, at such a young age, already knew the cruelty of contempt and violence. She stood up with difficulty, her knees protesting with every movement, and slowly approached Mia. She extended her trembling arms and told her not to be afraid, to come closer, that she wouldn't let anyone hurt her again. The girl, still with fear in her eyes, took a few hesitant steps toward her and finally let herself be enveloped by those arms that seemed fragile but contained an indestructible strength born of love. Alice held her tightly against her chest, feeling Mia's little body tremble with cold and fear, and whispered that she was not alone, that from that moment on, she would take care of her. Just when Alice had prayed for her own end, life sent her a reason to fight. Two broken souls, abandoned by their families, have found each other in the darkness. But how can a frail old woman and a terrified child possibly survive this? The girl's crying erupted in that embrace, as if she had finally found a safe place to break down. Alice stroked her tangled hair and repeated over and over that everything would be okay, that although she too had been abandoned by her own children, fate had brought them together on that road to keep each other company. She said that maybe life had taken away those they loved most, but that together they could survive, because the love they had found that night was stronger than any pain. Mia looked up at the old woman and asked in a weak voice if she could really trust that she would never be left alone. And Alice, with tears in her eyes, replied no, never again, that although she had nothing to give her, she would give her the only thing she still possessed, her heart and her care. That night, under the pale light of the moon, and in the silence of the countryside, two wounded souls met on the side of a road. The fragility of a betrayed mother and the broken innocence of an abused child united in an embrace that transformed loneliness into companionship and pain into an unexpected beginning. Alice felt that life had given her back a purpose, and Mia, for the first time in a long time, felt that someone was truly protecting her. They both lay down under the tree, one holding the other, and as the wind caressed their tired faces, they understood that this meeting was not chance, but a miracle destined to change their fates forever. In that moment, the crushing weight of her children's betrayal didn't disappear, but it shifted. It no longer felt like an end. Alice looked at the small, trusting face asleep on her arm and understood. Her 73 years of sacrifice had not been a waste. They had been practice. All her life, she had been a mother, and her children had tried to take that from her. But here, under a cold sky, life had given her one last, most important assignment. "I will not fail this one," she whispered to the darkness. This was no longer just survival. It was a mission. All her life, she had poured her love into two vessels that were now broken and empty. She had believed motherhood ended when Gregory and Sharon drove away. But as she held this shivering child, Alice realized her love wasn't gone. It had just lost its direction. Now, it had found a new one. This child was not of her blood, but she was of her pain. And that, Alice knew, was a bond just as strong. Dawn arrived, covering the dry earth with a cold, golden glow that made the branches of the nearby bushes crackle. And Alice, her body aching, and her mind still stunned by the memory of the abandonment, woke up feeling Mia moving restlessly beside her. The girl opened her eyes slowly and looked around with a fearful expression, as if she still couldn't believe she had escaped the house where she suffered so much pain. But when she saw that Alice was still there, sitting under the tree with her back straight and her eyes tired but full of tenderness, she relaxed a little and snuggled against her. Alice told her softly that a new day had come, and they had to face it together, because even though the world seemed cruel, there was always a reason to keep breathing. The old woman looked around and understood that if they wanted to survive, they needed food, and that although her strength was limited, she would do whatever it took for this girl whom destiny had placed in her path. Throughout the morning, a few travelers began to pass by on the dusty highway. Farmers with trucks loaded with sacks, merchants carrying fruit in makeshift carts, and a couple of men riding old bicycles. Alice, her pride wounded at having to hold out her hand after a lifetime of work, gathered her courage and approached them, asking for a little bread or fruit for the child. She explained in a trembling voice that they were alone, that they had spent the night without eating, and that she wasn't asking for herself, but for the little one who was hungry. Some men passed by without stopping, but others, moved by the fragility of the scene, offered them pieces of bread, oranges, or a stale roll. Mia, her eyes shining with emotion, received each item of food as if it were a treasure. And Alice felt that although the humiliation of begging pained her, it was worth it because she managed to see a spark of joy in the eyes of this girl who had suffered so much. It was then that Mia, while eagerly biting into a piece of bread a farmer had given them, began to laugh softly. It was a timid laugh at first, as if she was struggling to remember how, but it soon transformed into a clear, fresh laugh that filled the silence of the countryside with life. Alice watched her with tears in her eyes, and told her that her laugh was the most beautiful sound she had heard in a long time, that it was proof that despite the wounds, they could still find moments of happiness. Mia replied, saying she had never shared food with someone who truly looked at her with love, and that this piece of bread tasted different because she was eating it with her. Alice hugged her tightly and promised that as long as she had strength, she wouldn't let that laugh disappear, and that she would do everything possible to see her grow up happy. In that instant, she understood that what they were building went beyond survival. It was the birth of a relationship that filled the voids in both of them, a relationship where pain was transformed into companionship and hope. The hours passed slowly on the side of that road, and the nearby creek became their source of life. Every morning, Alice led Mia by the hand to the water, and together they bent down to drink, using their hands as makeshift cups. The cold water relieved their dry throats, and also served to wash their faces and feet, giving them a feeling of freshness that renewed their strength. Mia sometimes played with her reflection on the surface, and Alice watched her tenderly, thinking she was like a flower blooming again after being withered by pain. The old woman silently thanked nature for this simple but vital gift, telling herself that as long as that creek existed, they would have the chance to resist one more day. Alice, despite her fragility, acted strong in front of Mia, hiding the exhaustion that made her shiver at night and the pain in her legs, which became more unbearable each day. She didn't want the girl to see her weak or to think she was alone again. So she forced herself to stand tall, to smile even when her heart was breaking, and to encourage her with words of support. She told her they were like two warriors who had been thrown out into the open by the cruelty of others, but that together they had more strength than anyone could imagine. Mia responded with an admiring gaze and said that she was her grandmother of the heart, that even if they didn't share blood, she felt she loved her more than anyone in the world. Those words ignited an immense pride in Alice, and for the first time in a long time, she felt useful. She felt she had a true reason to fight. Thus, the days passed, feeding themselves with the little they got from kind travelers and quenching their thirst from the creek, sharing stories at dusk and sleeping together under the protection of the tree. Every moment of survival transformed into a stronger bond between them, and although life had shown them its cruelest face, both were beginning to discover that even in misery, they could find comfort in mutual companionship. Alice understood that the fragility of her body no longer mattered, because as long as she had the will to protect Mia, she would always find strength where it seemed there was none. And the girl, with her recovered laughter and her eyes full of trust, reminded her that love, even born in the midst of abandonment, could become the greatest strength to resist. The evening was falling slowly over the dusty highway. The sky, tinted with reddish and orange hues, announced that darkness would soon envelop everything. And Alice, her back resting against the tree that had become their makeshift shelter, tried to gather strength to comfort Mia, who was huddled beside her, distractedly playing with a dry twig while her stomach rumbled with hunger. They had been surviving for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 4 or 5 days since Mia arrived, thanks to the meager charity of a few travelers who gave them a piece of bread or a fruit, and the fresh water from the nearby creek, which was their only constant source of life. Alice knew this situation couldn't last much longer because her body no longer had the resilience of youth, and because the girl needed more than scraps to bring back the smile that was just beginning to reappear on her face. It was then, in the midst of these thoughts, that they heard the distant sound of a heavy engine breaking the silence of the highway, a sound that grew steadily louder until it was unmistakable. Alice stood up with effort, holding Mia's hand, and they both peered down the road as a cloud of dust rose in the distance. An enormous truck was approaching. Its metal body gleamed under the last rays of the sun, and the old woman's heart began to beat faster because she sensed this could be the chance they were waiting for. Mia looked at her with anxious eyes and asked if she thought the man would stop to help them, and Alice stroked her hair, saying they had to have faith, that there was still kindness in the world, even if it seemed hidden sometimes. The truck slowed down upon seeing the two figures by the tree and finally stopped, kicking up a gust of wind and dust that forced them to cover their faces with their hands. A robust man descended from the cab, his skin weathered by the sun and his gaze frank, wearing a plaid shirt with rolled-up sleeves and a cap that barely protected him from the heat. His hands were large and calloused, but his smile was broad and conveyed trust. He approached slowly and asked them what they were doing out there alone in such a dangerous and remote place. Alice, her voice still trembling with emotion, explained that she had been abandoned by her children, that they had left her with an old suitcase in the middle of the highway, and that by a twist of fate, she had found this girl who was fleeing the cruelty of her stepmother. Walter, which was the truck driver's name, frowned and shook his head in disbelief as he listened, unable to comprehend how someone could have a heart so hardened as to abandon their own mother or mistreat an innocent creature. Mia, hiding behind Alice, gathered her courage and, with tears in her eyes, told him that Veronica hit her and insulted her every day, that she told her she was a nuisance and didn't deserve to be loved. Walter crouched down to be at the girl's level and replied in a firm voice that she must never believe those words again, because people who hurt like that don't speak the truth, but rather from their own wickedness, and he assured her that she was worth more than she could imagine. As Alice related in more detail how they had survived those days, drinking water from the creek and depending on the charity of travelers, Walter put his hand on his chest, moved. He said he had traveled many roads and seen many injustices, but rarely had he felt such great indignation as he did at that moment. He clenched his fists and exclaimed that he wasn't going to leave them there, that he couldn't continue on his route knowing that two defenseless souls were going hungry and cold on the side of the highway. He looked at Alice with respect and told her she was a brave woman for not giving up, and that if she had held on until now, it was because life had something better prepared for both of them. Without thinking twice, Walter proposed they get in the back of his truck so he could take them to the city. Alice hesitated for a moment, fearing she would be another burden for a man who surely had his own destination. But he insisted, saying he wasn't doing it out of pity, but out of justice, because no one deserved the contempt or cruelty they had suffered. Mia, her eyes shining with hope, tugged gently on Alice's skirt and asked her to accept, because perhaps this was the way out they had been waiting for. The old woman, moved by the insistence of both, finally nodded and thanked the truck driver through sobs for his kindness. Walter smiled and helped them up, placing her suitcase in the truck bed alongside some sacks of corn he was transporting. It's amazing, isn't it? Her own children left her to die, but a complete stranger offers the simple human kindness she deserved. They are finally off that highway, but getting to a shelter is just the start. The real fight for justice, and for Mia, is about to begin. As Alice settled into the truck bed, the rough fabric of the corn sacks scratching her arms, she looked at the back of Walter's head. He was just a man, a stranger driving a truck. But to her, in that moment, he was an answer to a prayer she thought had gone unheard. He was not an angel with wings, but something more real. He was the simple, human goodness she had forgotten existed. The journey to the city took place under the moonlight, with the cool wind entering through the cracks of the truck bed. Mia lay her head in Alice's lap, who covered her with her shawl to protect her from the cold. While Walter whistled a tune from the cab to accompany the trip, Alice watched the horizon pass by and felt that every mile they left behind was also a step toward a new opportunity. And although the fear didn't disappear, the company of that noble man gave her a peace she hadn't known in a long time. She murmured that perhaps God had put him in their path like an angel of flesh and blood. And Mia replied with a tired smile, saying that now she could sleep peacefully because they weren't alone. When they arrived in the city, Walter stopped the truck in front of a modest but welcoming shelter. A simple, whitewashed building that took in homeless people. He got out first and then helped Alice and Mia down, making sure they didn't trip on the high step. He knocked on the door and explained the situation to the staff, detailing how he had found the two of them on the highway and what they had been through. The staff, moved, agreed to take them in without hesitation. Soon, they were offered hot plates of soup and fresh bread, and Mia, upon tasting the first spoonful, let out a laugh of relief that mingled with the tears of gratitude running down Alice's cheeks. That night, they slept in clean beds for the first time in a long time. Alice, lying next to Mia, whispered to her before closing her eyes, "Thank God that Mr. Walter found us, little one. Without him, we might still be out in the cold," Mia replied, saying she wanted to always remember him as the man who appeared in the darkest moment of their lives to give them a light of hope. Alice, moved, thought that perhaps destiny was beginning to turn in their favor, and with a slightly lighter heart, she allowed herself to sleep deeply, holding the girl she already considered her granddaughter of the soul. The next morning, a shelter volunteer quietly offered Alice and Mia clean, donated clothes, and access to a hot shower. For Alice, the feeling of warm water cascading over her aching bones, something she had taken for granted her entire life, was so overwhelming she had to lean against the tiled wall, sobbing silently. It wasn't just the warmth. It was the return of her dignity. When Mia emerged, scrubbed clean, her tangled hair combed, wearing a simple yellow dress, Alice saw her for the first time not as a victim, but simply as a child. Mia looked at her own clean hands in wonder. "It doesn't hurt, Alice," Mia whispered, referring to the hot water. Alice realized with a fresh stab of horror that the child likely associated even bathing with Veronica's cruelty. "It will never hurt again," Alice promised, her voice fierce. That first night in the shelter, sleep did not come easily, despite the clean bed. The silence was different, not the empty, cold silence of the highway, but a safe, shared silence. Alice lay awake, listening to Mia's soft, even breathing. For the first time in days, the child wasn't trembling. Alice realized her own hands had finally stopped shaking. She thought of the hard ground under the tree, the gnawing hunger. This simple cot felt like a king's bed. It wasn't just physical safety she felt. It was the return of something she thought was gone forever: purpose. She was no longer just a victim waiting to die on a roadside. She was Mia's protector. Meanwhile, in the silence of the city, Walter started his truck again and drove away through the illuminated streets, satisfied that he had done the right thing, leaving behind 2 lives he had rescued from loneliness and despair. The morning at the shelter began with a different murmur than the previous days, a murmur that announced movement, interest, attention. Alice, still with her body tired from the nights of cold and abandonment, woke up with the feeling that something important was about to happen. Mia was still sleeping, clutching a clean blanket the shelter staff had given her, and for the first time in a long time, her face reflected peace. Alice watched her tenderly and told herself that although she didn't know how or when, she would do whatever was necessary to give this girl a different future. However, just as she sat up in bed, she noticed the presence of 2 women dressed in social worker uniforms approaching her, holding folders and wearing serious but empathetic expressions. One of them explained that the case had reached the local Illinois authorities thanks to the report from the shelter and the testimony given by Walter, the truck driver who had rescued them on the road. They told her it was necessary to investigate both the abandonment she had suffered and the abuse the little girl Mia reported. Alice, her heart sinking, felt fear for a moment because she didn't want them to separate her from the child, but she also knew she couldn't stay silent, that the time had come to tell the truth. She and Mia were taken to a modest office within the same shelter, where a local judge had arranged to see them immediately, given the seriousness of the story. The man, with gray hair and a stern but compassionate expression, looked at them intently as he listened first to the social worker's report and then to Alice's trembling voice, narrating in detail how her children, Gregory and Sharon, had deceived her with the promise of a trip to the country, only to abandon her on the highway as if she were an unwanted burden. She explained with tears in her eyes that she had wandered, disoriented, that she had spent entire nights outdoors, and that in the midst of that loneliness, she had heard Mia's cry, finding her wounded in soul and body by the abuse of her stepmother, Veronica. The judge frowned and said that such cruelty was inconceivable, that it was his duty to order an immediate investigation to determine responsibility and to protect both the old woman and the child. He ordered that Gregory and Sharon be located so they could answer for the abandonment, and to summon Mr. Raymond, Mia's father, to inform him of what was happening and confront him with the reality he seemed unaware of. That same day, medical specialists arrived at the shelter to check Mia's physical condition. The girl was shy and scared, but Alice stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand and repeating that she wasn't alone. The doctors professionally noted every detail in their reports: marks on her arms that were evidence of beatings, old bruises on her back, signs of malnutrition and neglect. One of them said in a low voice that there was no doubt the girl had been a victim of constant domestic violence. Mia cried as she recounted to the social workers how Veronica hit her with a belt, how she forced her to stand for hours, and how she yelled at her that she didn't deserve anyone's love. Alice felt her heart break every time she heard those words, but at the same time, a new strength was born in her, thinking that now, finally, someone was listening to her, that it was no longer a secret kept in the shadow of a house full of pain. The news soon reached the local newspapers. A young-faced but keen-eyed reporter appeared at the shelter with a notebook and a small recorder, asking permission to interview the old woman who had been abandoned and was now fighting to protect a mistreated child. Alice hesitated at first, fearing the exposure, but then she understood that her voice could serve as an example, to show that abandonment and violence should not be hidden. Sitting on a wooden bench in the shelter's courtyard, she told the reporter everything she had experienced, how her own children had betrayed her, and how, in the midst of that tragedy, she had found Mia and decided never to let her go. She said with tears in her eyes that although her children by blood had despised her, Life had given her a daughter of the heart, and she would not let anyone separate her from her. The reporter, moved, wrote down every word and promised her that her story would be told with respect. The next day, the Illinois newspapers ran headlines about the woman abandoned on the highway and the abused child who had found refuge by her side. The photographs showed Alice with her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and Mia held in her lap with a timid but hopeful gaze. The community began to react, some with indignation at the cruelty of Gregory and Sharon, others with solidarity toward the old woman who, despite her fragility, showed herself to be strong and willing to fight for the child. Alice, reading those printed words, felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear for the consequences that would come, but relief because they were no longer alone, because the truth had come to light, and with it, the hope for justice was born. That night, as Mia slept peacefully in her bed at the shelter, Alice looked out the window at the city lights and whispered to herself that there was no turning back now, that the pain they had lived through wouldn't be erased, but that now, with the support of the authorities and the people who had heard their story, they had a real chance to start over. She said that although her body was weak, her spirit was stronger than ever, and she would fight until her last breath to make sure that Mia never again felt the cold of abandonment or the weight of violence. With that promise in her heart, she closed her eyes and let sleep envelop her, knowing that the truth had finally begun to open a path toward justice for them. The morning sun harshly illuminated the old buildings of the Illinois town when Mr. Twetty, Raymond, received the official notification from the court. He had been summoned for an urgent appearance in the proceedings related to his daughter Mia and his wife Veronica. The man, accustomed to the routines of his business and the serenity he had always tried to maintain in his life, felt the ground wobble beneath his feet as he read the first lines of the document. It spoke of child abuse, of formal complaints, of irrefutable medical evidence indicating that his little Mia had been a victim of violence within his own home. Raymond was speechless, the paper trembling in his hands as his blood boiled in his veins. For years, he had trusted Veronica. He had believed her sweet words and her promises to be a good wife and stepmother. And yet, reality was hitting him with brutal force. He had been deceived, manipulated, blinded by the appearance of a woman who hid cruelty behind a smile. When he arrived at the courthouse, he was met by the judge handling the case and by the social workers who had been by Alice and Mia's side. With a serious expression, the judge asked him to sit and showed him the medical reports prepared by the specialists who had examined the girl. Raymond took them with trembling hands, and as he read, he felt each word was a direct blow to his heart. Old bruises on her back, marks on her arms consistent with being hit with objects, signs of malnutrition, and prolonged neglect. He closed his eyes for a moment and murmured that he couldn't believe it, that it was impossible that the woman he shared his life with could have done so much harm to his daughter. The judge replied in a firm voice that the facts were documented, that they were not fabrications or exaggerations, and that, as a father, he had to take responsibility for protecting Mia immediately. Raymond asked to see his daughter, and when he entered the room where the little girl was waiting with Alice, he knelt in front of her, tears streaming down his face. He told her he was sorry, that he had been blind, that he hadn't seen what was happening under his own roof, and that although nothing could erase what she had suffered, he promised her he would never again let anyone hurt her. Mia looked at him with eyes full of confusion and pain and told him that she had asked him for help many times, but he didn't seem to listen, that when she tried to tell him what was happening, Veronica always convinced him it was just a spoiled child's tantrums. Raymond gritted his teeth in anger and swore aloud that he had been a fool, that he had let lies envelop him, but that now everything would change. Alice, who observed the scene with serenity and firmness, approached and told him they were still in time to save Mia, that the important thing was for him to make a brave decision and face the truth, even if it hurt. News of the evidence soon reached Veronica's ears. When she was summoned to testify, she appeared at the courthouse dressed elegantly, her hair perfectly styled, and an expression of false indignation on her face. She tried to defend herself, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that the girl made up stories because she didn't accept her authority, that Alice was manipulating the situation to gain everyone's sympathy. But her words fell apart when the judge showed her the photographs of Mia's injuries and the testimonies from neighbors who had heard screaming and hitting from the house. A heavy silence fell in the room. Veronica's face, once a mask of false indignation, finally cracked. Fear raw, animal fear flashed in her eyes as she saw her entire world collapsing. It was then that Raymond, his face pale with a terrifying rage, stood up. He didn't shout. He spoke in a low, trembling voice that was far more frightening. "You, monster." He turned to the judge. "I am filing for immediate divorce, and I demand." "No, I beg the court to ensure this. This creature never comes near my daughter again. She must answer for every scar." He told the judge that he was filing for an immediate divorce and that he demanded Veronica answer to the law for every tear Mia had shed. The truth brought to light by Alice has just shattered this family. While Veronica faces justice, Mr. Raymond is facing his own failure. But with her father back, where does this leave Alice and the powerful bond she's formed with Mia? The legal process moved quickly due to the gravity of the facts. Veronica's lawyers tried to soften the situation, arguing that she needed psychological help, not severe punishment. But the court did not ignore the overwhelming evidence. The judge delivered the sentence, imposing a long period of community service on Veronica, in addition to the obligation to undergo intensive psychological therapy to address her violent behavior. He also forbade her from approaching Mia without supervision, thus ensuring the girl would not fall victim to her cruelty again. Veronica, who until that moment had always lived a life of pride and appearances, felt her world collapse, and although she tried to maintain her composure, inside her burned the humiliation of being exposed and condemned. Raymond left the courthouse with a tired but determined face. He took Mia's hand, who looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope, and told her the worst was over, that now he was ready to be the father she deserved. He promised he would be by her side every step of the way, that there would be no more lies or excuses, only a real commitment to protect and love her. Alice walked beside him with her head held high, and Raymond turned to her to thank her in a broken voice, saying that thanks to her courage, the truth had come to light, that without her, he might never have opened his eyes. Alice replied, saying he owed her nothing, that she had simply done what her heart asked her to do, protect the child that life had given her as an unexpected gift. Thus, with Veronica's conviction and Raymond's firm decision to change, Mia's life began to find a different path. There were still deep wounds to heal, but at least the shadow of violence no longer threatened to destroy her. Alice, though fragile in body, remained strong in spirit, knowing the fight wasn't over yet, but confident that love and justice were finally on their side. That evening, Raymond returned to an empty house. The silence, once filled with Veronica's false sweetness and Mia's suppressed fear, was now deafening. He walked into Mia's small, neat bedroom, a room Veronica had decorated but never filled with love. He picked up a small, forgotten teddy bear, its button eye missing. He saw the medical reports again in his mind, the photographs of the bruises. His failure as a father hit him like a physical blow. He had been so focused on his own happiness, his own peace, that he had allowed a monster to sleep under his roof and harm his child. Alice, an elderly woman abandoned by the world, had shown more courage in a few days than he had shown in years. He knew then that thanking her was not enough. He had to prove he was worthy of being the father she had saved for him. The day Raymond decided to visit Alice at the shelter, the morning dawned with a different air, as if the sky itself wanted to cleanse the city after the storm that the revealed truth about Veronica had meant. The sun shone with a warm glow, and the bells of a nearby church echoed in the cobblestone streets of the Illinois town. Raymond walked with firm steps, but with a heavy heart, knowing he had to face a moment that would change his life and his daughter's forever. He carried in his memory the image of Mia in the courthouse, her tears mixed with words of pain, and the image of Alice, an old woman with a fragile body, but an unbreakable spirit, holding her as if the blood tie didn't matter, as if love is born in the very instant two wounded souls recognize each other. As he approached the shelter entrance, he told himself that words wouldn't be enough, that no gesture could repay the nobility of this woman who had done what he, in his blindness, had failed to do: protect his daughter from cruelty. When he entered the modest courtyard of the shelter, He saw Alice sitting on a wooden bench, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze lost on the horizon. Her gray hair, pulled back in a simple bun, shone in the morning light. And although her wrinkles showed the relentless passage of time, in her eyes there was a warm light that spoke of dignity and strength. Raymond approached slowly, and when she looked up and recognized him, a silence thick with emotion enveloped them. He took a deep breath and, in a trembling voice, told her that he had no words to thank her for what she had done for Mia, that no wealth or favor could compensate for the nobility of saving a child who was not hers by blood, but whom she had taken in as if she were part of her soul. Alice looked at him intently and replied that she didn't need gratitude, that she hadn't acted expecting a reward, that she had simply done what any mother of the heart would do: extend her arms to someone in need. Because when you are a mother, you never stop being one, even if your own blood turns its back on you. Raymond lowered his head in shame and confessed that he felt guilty, that he had been blind for too long, that he allowed Mia to suffer in silence while he defended a woman who only brought him pain. He said he didn't know how to repair so much damage, but that he was willing to dedicate the rest of his life to showing his daughter that now she could trust him. Alice placed a trembling hand on Raymond's and told him he shouldn't torment himself with what had already passed, that life always offers a chance to restart, that the important thing was that he had opened his eyes before it was too late. She assured him that Mia still loved him because children, despite the pain, keep a hope in their hearts that adults often lose. At that moment, Mia appeared, running from inside the shelter, her hair disheveled and her face lit up with a smile she hadn't shown in a long time. Upon seeing her father, she let out a happy cry and threw herself into his arms. Raymond lifted her off the ground and held her against his chest with such force that it seemed he wanted to merge with her, never to be separated again. Through tears, he told her he loved her, that he regretted every night he wasn't there to protect her, that he would never again allow anyone to hurt her. Mia looked at him tenderly and told him she had waited for him for a long time, that although she was afraid he would never hear her, she had always dreamed of this hug. Alice watched the scene with tears in her eyes, and in her heart, she felt that this moment was a small victory against abandonment and injustice, proof that even the deepest wounds could begin to close when love returned. The following days were filled with legal motions and meetings with the authorities. The judge, aware of the gravity of what had happened, decided it was time to resolve Mia's custody on a provisional basis. He listened attentively to Alice's testimony, Raymond's statement, and the voice of the girl herself, who said firmly that she wanted to live with her father, but without being separated from Alice, because in her arms she had found the love she so desperately needed. The judge, moved by the sincerity of her words, announced that he was granting full provisional custody to Raymond, as he was the child's father. However, recognizing Alice's vital role in Mia's rescue and safety, the judge issued a temporary protection order that included guaranteed, frequent visitation rights for Alice, stating that her presence was fundamental to the girl's emotional recovery while the final investigation concluded. When the ruling was read, Raymond looked at Alice with a gesture of respect and said he was grateful that the justice system recognized what he already knew, that Mia was alive thanks to her, that he could never deny the bond they had created. Alice responded softly, saying she wasn't looking for recognition, that the only thing she wanted was for Mia to grow up happy, surrounded by true love. Mia, hearing those words, hugged them both at the same time and said that now she had a different, but complete family. A father who was finally willing to protect her, and a grandmother of the heart who would never leave her alone. That night, back at the shelter, Alice lay in her bed, her soul filled with gratitude. She thought that life had hit her hard, that she had tasted the bitter flavor of her own children's betrayal, but that it had also shown her that love could be reborn in the most unexpected places. She murmured a prayer of thanks, not for the material things she didn't have, but for the blessing of having found in Mia a reason to keep going, and in Raymond an ally to fight with. She understood that although life had taken so much from her, it had also given her back hope. And with that certainty in her heart, she closed her eyes, knowing her sacrifice had not been in vain, because she had sown love where before there was only loneliness. The first few days were fragile. Raymond, now in an empty house, found himself terrified of his own daughter. He didn't know what to cook for her, how to braid her hair, or how to comfort her when she woke up screaming from nightmares of Veronica. On the third day, desperate, he went to the shelter, not as a father, but as a student. "I don't know how," he admitted to Alice, his voice broken with shame. "She saved you," Alice said simply. "Now you must save her. It is not done with grand gestures, Raymond. It is done with oatmeal in the morning, with reading a story at night, and with being there when she falls. You start by just being present." Raymond listened, truly listened, for the first time. He hadn't just gained a daughter in that courtroom. He had gained a teacher in the woman who had become her true mother. The news had spread throughout the region, and not only the neighbors in the Illinois town, but also people from nearby counties spoke with emotion about the story of the old woman abandoned on a lonely road who had found a mistreated child and who together had survived misery until the truth came to light. The newspapers reported the events with headlines that denounced the ingratitude of the children who had left their mother like an old object. And local television broadcast interviews in which Alice spoke humbly of her pain, but also of the hope she had found in Mia. It was precisely in front of a television screen in a bar that Gregory and Sharon, almost by chance, saw their mother's face after weeks of silence. Time seemed to stop when they recognized those deep wrinkles and those tear-filled eyes that, despite everything, shone with an intact tenderness. Shame hit them with unbearable force, and for the first time since the day they decided to abandon her, they saw themselves as the cowards they were. Sharon, her voice breaking, murmured that she couldn't stand that image, that she never imagined her mother would appear on television talking about abandonment, and that hearing her say she had been betrayed by those she loved most was like a knife in her soul. Gregory put his face in his hands and admitted that the weight of guilt was consuming him, that he hadn't been able to sleep peacefully since that day, and that now, seeing his mother transformed into a symbol of strength, he understood that what they had done had no human forgiveness. The shame was amplified by the whispers they now heard everywhere. At the grocery store, old neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Sharon confessed that her own husband looked at her differently, with a coldness she now recognized because it was the same coldness she had shown her mother. Gregory admitted his business partners were pulling out, citing a moral character clause. They weren't just guilty, they were pariahs. They hadn't just lost their mother. They had lost their lives as they knew them. They spent several hours in silence, each trapped in their own thoughts. Until finally, Gregory said they had to find her, that they couldn't keep hiding behind their shame, that even if they didn't deserve to be forgiven, they had to kneel before her and beg for mercy. Sharon nodded, tears streaming down her face, and together they set off toward the shelter where they knew their mother was. The journey was an ordeal, not because of the distance, but because of the weight of the memories. Every curve in the road brought back the image of that day they made her get out of the car, the suitcase in her hands, the pleas on her lips. They remembered how Alice screamed their names, begging them not to leave her, and how they hardened their hearts and drove off without looking back. Now, with their souls torn apart, they understood they had made the worst mistake of their lives. When they arrived at the shelter, they asked for her in trembling voices, and the staff, though looking at them with suspicion, agreed to guide them to the courtyard where Alice was sitting with Mia, telling her a simple story while the girl laughed with innocence. When the old woman looked up and saw her children approaching, her heart skipped a beat. For an instant, the pain of the past mixed with surprise, and her lips tightened as if trying to hold back a storm. Gregory was the first to fall to his knees in front of her, his eyes overflowing with tears. He told her he was a coward, that he had betrayed her in the vilest way, that every day since he had felt a part of him die, remembering her face full of desperation. Sharon followed him, also kneeling, and between sobs, she asked for forgiveness, confessing that remorse haunted her, that she had dreamed of that scene over and over and could find no peace. They both pleaded with broken words that they didn't deserve her forgiveness, but that they were begging for a chance to redeem themselves. They are finally here, kneeling in the very dust they left her in. But is this true remorse, or is it just the sting of public shame? Alice now holds all the power, facing the children who broke her. Her next words will change everything. Alice looked down at the faces of her children, soaked in tears, kneeling in the shelter's dust. For a fleeting moment, she didn't see the adults who had condemned her to die. She saw the toddlers who used to cling to her skirt. A wave of raw, maternal pain washed over her, a pain deeper than the abandonment itself. Part of her wanted to scream, to ask them why. But as she looked at Mia, who was watching the scene with wide, serious eyes, Alice understood. Holding on to hatred would be poisoning the new life she had found. Her children had broken her, but Mia had rebuilt her. Her forgiveness, she realized, was not a gift she was giving them. It was the final step in her own liberation. Alice looked at them in silence, her soul divided between the mother's love that never dies and the deep wound of betrayal. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice, when she spoke, was calm and firm. She told them she forgave them, that she held no hatred in her heart, because resentment only destroys the one who harbors it. However, she also told them that she was no longer the same, that the woman who once lived for them had been left on the road where they abandoned her, and that now her mission was different. She explained that God had given her a child named Mia, who came into her life at her loneliest moment, and that from then on, her purpose was to care for her, protect her, and give her the love her children had denied her. Gregory, his voice breaking, replied that he understood, that he knew they had lost their place in her heart, but that he still asked for the chance to be near, even if only as shadows in the distance. Sharon added that she wanted to make amends, even if it took the rest of her life serving her and proving that not all was lost. Alice listened to them intently and finally told them they could visit her, that the door to her life was not completely closed, but that they had to understand they would no longer be the center of her existence. She said firmly that Mia was her priority now, that the love she had cultivated in her was sacred, and that no one would turn her from that path. This is her true victory. Alice finds the strength to forgive, not for them, but for herself. She's no longer their victim, she is Mia's protector. She has closed the door on her old life. But one final question remains. Will the law recognize the new family she has built? Mia, who had listened to everything attentively, clung to Alice's hand and looked at her with big, trusting eyes. She told her not to be afraid, that she would always be with her, that it didn't matter who came or who asked for forgiveness, because her place was secure in her heart. Alice smiled tenderly and stroked her hair, confirming that nothing would change between them. Gregory and Sharon walked away from the shelter in a daze. The drive back to their lives was steeped in a toxic silence, the polar opposite of the cold, business-like silence on the day they drove their mother to the highway. Alice's forgiveness felt heavier than condemnation. It was not an absolution, but a severance. She looked right through me, Sharon whispered, her voice cracking. She looked at us, Gregory corrected, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, like we are the strangers now. And she's right. They both knew, without saying it, that the inheritance and freedom they had so callously sought by abandoning her was now worthless. They had traded their mother for dust, and now dust was all they had left. Gregory and Sharon wept inconsolably, knowing that forgiveness had come, but that trust had been broken forever, and that now they could only wait humbly for time to give them a second chance to rebuild something with their mother. That night, back in her room at the shelter, Alice felt at peace. She had forgiven, she had released the weight of resentment, but she had also declared her new truth, that motherhood doesn't end with blood or betrayal, that it is always renewed where there is true love. And as Mia snuggled beside her, the old woman understood that the painful road had led her to this moment, where she could close old wounds and open herself to a future where, at last, she would not be alone. The courtroom was filled with a solemn silence as the judge, in a firm and serious voice, announced the final resolution of the case that had moved the entire Illinois community. After weeks of hearings, testimonies, and irrefutable proof, the time had come to bring legal closure to a story marked by abandonment, pain, and hope. The judge looked at Alice with respect, at Raymond with stern understanding, and at Mia with fatherly tenderness, aware that his decision would change their 3 lives forever. He then declared that permanent custody of the child would fall to her father, Mr. Raymond. Furthermore, in recognition of the extraordinary circumstances and the profound bond formed, the court granted Alice formal grandmother's rights, legally recognizing her as a permanent guardian and figure in Mia's life. ensuring her rights to care and co-decision in the child's upbringing could not be challenged. The words resounded like a balm in Alice's heart. She closed her eyes for an instant and let a tear of relief escape as Mia jumped for joy and hugged the old woman tightly, saying they would never have to be separated again. Raymond, moved, stood up from his seat and shook the judge's hand to thank him. But he immediately turned to Alice and told her, his voice breaking, that he could never repay her enough, that if he had the chance to rebuild his life with his daughter, it was solely thanks to her, and that from that day on, he committed not only to being a present father, but also an adoptive son to this woman life had placed in his path. Alice replied serenely, saying she wanted no gratitude, that the only thing she desired was to see Mia grow up happy, surrounded by love, and far from the shadow of violence. She squeezed the girl's hand and told her that this was the real miracle, that the legal ruling only confirmed what already existed in their hearts, a family formed by shared pain, but united by hope. Weeks later, life began to take on a different rhythm. With the help of some local authorities and supportive neighbors who were moved by her story, Alice moved into a small house near the school where Mia had been enrolled. The house was modest, with white walls and a tiny garden where red geraniums bloomed, which she tended to herself with care. But for Alice, it was a paradise because it meant being close to the child, accompanying her in her daily life, and giving her what she knew best how to give: affection and advice. Every morning, when Mia left for school, Alice saw her off at the door with a murmured blessing and a smile that filled the little girl with security. In the afternoons, she waited for her with a plate of warm soup and freshly baked bread, and together they shared simple conversations that wove unforgettable memories. Raymond, for his part, had decided to radically transform his life. He had left behind the passive comfort that had led him to ignore his daughter's suffering and had become an active, present, and grateful man. Every day he spent hours with Mia, helping her with her homework, listening to her stories, taking her for walks in the town square, or simply sitting with her in silence, enjoying her company. On more than one occasion, he confessed that he was learning to be a father almost from scratch, that he felt guilty about the past, but that the love they now shared was so strong, it gave him the strength to move forward. He also constantly sought out Alice to consult her on things, from cooking recipes to life advice, and he frequently told her that she was not only Mia's grandmother, but also his teacher, the compass he had needed to not get lost again. The relationship between the three became a refuge, a healing space where every wound found comfort. Mia, who used to live in fear and silence, began to blossom into a happy and curious child. At school, she stood out for her open smile and the tenderness with which she spoke of her grandmother Alice, whom she described as the person who taught her she would never be alone. The teachers noticed the change and commented that the girl radiated a special light, as if she had been reborn after the darkness. Alice, hearing these comments, would get emotional and give thanks in silence, convinced that her painful abandonment had served a purpose, to save that little girl destiny had placed in her path. Over time, even the community learned something from this story. Many neighbors, seeing them walk together through the streets, understood that family isn't always born from blood, but from love and sacrifice. Raymond gained respect for his dedication, and Alice became a symbol of strength for everyone, especially for the older women who saw in her an example of dignity in the face of ingratitude. Mia, in her innocence, became the living hope that forgiveness and affection could heal any wound. The final scene of this story occurred on a golden afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the low hills surrounding the Illinois town. Raymond had invited Alice and Mia to walk through the main square, where the trees cast long shadows and the air smelled of fresh bread from the nearby bakeries. The three walked hand in hand, laughing with the naturalness of those who have learned to value every moment. Mia skipped between them, excitedly telling them about her day's adventures at school, and Raymond watched her with pride while holding Alice's hand firmly, silently grateful for the chance to live that moment. When they reached a quiet corner of the square, Alice stopped for a moment and looked at the horizon, illuminated by the last glimmers of the Sunday. She felt her heart fill with a deep peace, and in a soft but emotional voice, she murmured that the road where they had abandoned her was the same one that gave her a daughter of the heart. Raymond looked at her with restrained tears and told her that this sentence summed up everything they had lived through, because in the midst of pain, a family had been born. Mia, not fully understanding the depth of the words, smiled and replied that as long as they were together, they would lack nothing. Thus, under the glow of a golden sunset, a new beginning was sealed for the three of them. Alice, who had known betrayal and loneliness, found in Mia the reason to keep going. Raymond, who had been blind, learned to be a true father. And Mia, who had suffered the cruelty of a stepmother, discovered that love can be reborn in the most unexpected places. The story that began with abandonment and tears transformed into a testament of hope, forgiveness, and love that transcends blood. The road where Alice was abandoned seemed to be the end, but it was actually the beginning of a true family. She proved that mother is not a word defined by blood relations, but an act of unconditional love. The story of Alice, Mia, and Raymond reminds us that even when those we love most turn their backs, fate can still bring other souls to heal our wounds. What do you think about Alice's forgiveness toward Gregory and Sharon? Was their regret too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read them. If this story touched you, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we have many more emotional journeys waiting for you. Thank you for listening.